This report does not seek to fascinate, it seeks to understand. Understanding is not excusing, it is refusing to let it happen again in the shadows.
A quiet classroom hums with the gentle scratch of chalk against a slate board. A teacher with thick glasses meticulously explains literature to attentive students. Then the homicides begin. The illusion of normalcy shatters, leaving a chilling void. What does it take for an ordinary person to become a predator? And how does society fail to see it? From 1978 to 1990, a silent wave of crimes plagued the isolated Soviet woodlands. Throughout this analysis, we will refer to our subject as the Red Forest Beast. Operating across vast transit networks, he selected victims from the margins of a crumbling empire. The profile utilized secluded areas near train stations to mask the devastating attacks. Every interaction was carefully calculated, exploiting trust at various bus stops and remote railway hubs. He moved with alarming mobility, ensuring his actions remained completely hidden from authorities. The subject weaponized the systemic failures and ideological blind spots of local investigators. An absolute refusal to acknowledge such a profile existed allowed him to continue his hunt. His signature involved profound premeditation, isolating vulnerable targets where their cries would echo into nothingness. The sheer impact of his crimes ultimately shattered a nation's illusion of safety. Forensic anomalies and the resistance of a rigid bureaucracy shielded the subject for over a decade. He carefully manipulated the environment, leaving investigators chasing shadows through the forest. Decades later, the magnitude of these disappearances still haunts the collective memory. We must carefully examine the scattered crime scenes to understand how he operated entirely unchecked. Over 50 individuals vanished before detectives finally pierced the veil of deceit. Now we examine the evidence and retrace the chilling path he walked through the darkening landscape. To the outside world, the subject presented an impeccable illusion of mediocrity. He was an unremarkable figure, a dedicated teacher, and a seemingly devoted family man. He operated within a system that demanded absolute conformity. By blending perfectly into the rigid structures of society, the profile rendered himself entirely invisible to his peers. This elaborate social camouflage was carefully constructed. He pursued higher education, obtained respectable degrees, and embedded himself deeply within the bureaucratic machinery of the state. Neighbors saw a quiet, submissive citizen who consistently followed the rules. The subject actively used this banal exterior as a psychological shield, deflecting any possible scrutiny. His integration was so complete that colleagues willingly overlooked minor deviances. He manipulated their perception, ensuring they saw only a pathetic, harmless, and socially awkward man. The facade relied heavily on the societal refusal to acknowledge malevolence within its own ranks. He exploited this severe ideological blind spot to maintain his flawless cover. Beneath this curated shell of normalcy, a profound psychological dissonance festered. The profile harbored intense feelings of inadequacy, masked entirely by his outward projection of academic authority. Every single interaction was a calculated performance. He meticulously mimicked ordinary human empathy, learning the precise societal rhythms necessary to survive without drawing any unwanted attention. He specifically sought positions of minor authority, surrounding himself with vulnerable populations. These roles granted him absolute trust, creating the perfect hunting ground hidden in plain sight. His arranged marriage served as the ultimate prop. A wife and children provided the necessary domestic anchor, cementing his image as an ordinary, functioning member of society. Yet, the psychological mechanics of his deception required constant, exhausting vigilance. The subject channeled his immense internal rage into maintaining the delicate architecture of his everyday life. By playing the role of the tragic, bullied victim of circumstance, he successfully disarmed those around him. Pity became his most effective and highly insidious weapon. He functioned as an emotional parasite, absorbing the expected norms of his environment only to reflect them back. This mirroring effect ensured his true nature remained completely concealed. The deception was a masterpiece of pathological adaptation. He understood perfectly that true invisibility required an absolute commitment to an exceptionally boring, unremarkable, and forgettable existence. His charm was entirely artificial, a learned survival mechanism rather than a genuine connection. He smiled, nodded, and agreed, all while secretly harboring apocalyptic and violent desires. Detectives and local authorities initially discarded his file. His bureaucratic existence was simply too mundane, too painfully ordinary to match the psychological profile of a ruthless predator. The subject weaponized his own physical weakness and quiet demeanor. Nobody could fathom that this pathetic, shuffling academic possessed the absolute capacity for such profound, systematic destruction. The perfect mask allowed the subject to walk freely among his future targets. He became a literal ghost, operating flawlessly within the margins of a decaying society. He constructed a labyrinth of lies so dense that even he sometimes retreated into its safety. The mask became his reality, a necessary barrier against his own madness. But the immense pressure of maintaining this illusion was destined to fracture. What happens when the carefully constructed human disguise finally slips, revealing the absolute void beneath? The subject's origins are deeply rooted in profound geopolitical and domestic trauma. Born during a catastrophic famine, his earliest memories were defined by absolute deprivation. His mother frequently recounted a horrifying narrative. An older sibling had allegedly been abducted and consumed by starving neighbors during the harshest years of starvation. Whether true or not, this macabre story profoundly damaged his developing psyche. It established a subconscious link between basic survival, absolute terror, and human consumption. This environment of fear was severely compounded by domestic instability. He suffered from chronic bedwetting, which provoked relentless physical beatings and profound humiliation from his mother. The profile endured relentless bullying from peers due to his physical frailty. He retreated inward, cultivating a silent, burning resentment toward a society that rejected him. The shadow of war further fractured his identity. His father was captured in combat and later vilified as a traitor upon his return, bringing immense shame. Exposed to the extreme brutality of military occupation, the young boy retreated into dark fantasies. He imagined luring invading soldiers into isolated woodlands for violent retribution. A severe biological anomaly further alienated the subject. Congenital conditions left him suffering from profound physical dysfunction, rendering conventional intimacy a source of paralyzing anxiety. This inadequacy became the central pillar of his psychological collapse. Every failed attempt at human connection only deepened his overwhelming sense of isolation and intense rage. At age 15, a crucial and devastating psychological shift occurred. An awkward attempt at physical intimacy resulted in premature release during a panicked, clumsy struggle. The resulting ridicule from his peers was absolute and unforgiving. This profound humiliation permanently warped his understanding of human relationships and the mechanics of physical arousal. 2 years later, he forcefully wrestled a younger girl to the ground. Though unable to perform conventionally, the sheer physical struggle itself triggered a sudden release. This specific incident forged a catastrophic neurological pathway. The subject subconsciously learned that physical domination and violent struggle could successfully bypass his profound biological limitations. Violence became the only functional substitute for intimacy. To compensate for his perceived inferiority, he developed a desperate need to exert absolute control over vulnerable targets. He harbored a rich, disturbing fantasy life capable of fueling his growing appetite. The internal pressure continued to build beneath his carefully constructed, banal societal mask. For years, the profile managed to contain these dark urges. He sought refuge in academic pursuits and bureaucratic roles, attempting to outrun his escalating internal madness. Yet, the psychological weight of constant rejection and biological failure proved insurmountable. The traumatic residue of his childhood demanded a physical outlet that society could not provide. Humiliation acts as a powerful catalyst for the psychopathic mind. Unable to direct his rage at his oppressors, he projected his intense hatred onto innocent strangers. The careful balance between his ordinary outward existence and his monstrous internal desires was fundamentally unsustainable. The pressure had reached a critical, irreversible breaking point. The fractured pieces of his identity finally aligned into something truly terrifying. Now that we understand what broke him, what happened when he finally crossed the line. In behavioral analysis, we clearly separate the practical from the pathological. Modus operandi is the method of operation. The signature is the dark, underlying psychological compulsion. His method relied entirely on geographic and spatial dynamics. The subject utilized vast transit networks, haunting railway stations and bus depots to locate highly vulnerable, isolated targets. He expertly identified runaways and marginalized individuals. The profile initiated contact with calculated ruses, offering rare stamps, directions, or simple companionship to earn their immediate trust. He projected a pathetic, harmless demeanor. This disarming camouflage made him invisible, allowing the subject to seamlessly blend into the banal background of daily urban life. Once trust was established, the practical phase concluded. He guided his targets away from crowded transport hubs and into desolate, dense woodland strips to ensure absolute isolation. The desolate forest strips provided a sensory vacuum. Within these dark margins, the desperate cries of the vulnerable were completely swallowed by the surrounding heavy foliage. Control was the final utilitarian step. The subject often bound their hands with rope, securing total physical dominance before the horrific reality of his psychological signature took over. The signature is what the predator absolutely needs to do to fulfill his darkest fantasies. For this profile, violence was not a means to an end. Clinical evaluations identified a profound necrosadistic compulsion. Conventional intimacy was biologically impossible, forcing the subject to substitute physical affection with catastrophic, escalating physical destruction. The sheer brutality of the attacks compensated for his profound biological failure. His inability to perform conventionally was replaced by an absolute, terrifying command over his targets. The attacks followed a precise, terrifying rhythm. He inflicted numerous shallow strikes to build his own arousal, using a blade to physically simulate the act of intercourse. The subject required the victim to suffer. The prolonged terror and agony of the targets were essential components, fueling his complex, deeply disturbed neurological pathways of arousal. The moment of the victim's ultimate demise triggered his physiological release. The sheer physical struggle functioned as a pathological bypass for his deep-seated psychological and biological inadequacies. The psychological ritual extended post-mortem. Early on, he systematically wounded the victim's eyes, driven by a paranoid superstition that their retinas captured his final, predatory image. Beyond superstition, blinding the targets served a deep psychological purpose. Eliminating their vision finally eradicated the judging gaze of a society that had mocked him his entire life. He engaged in specific, repetitive tissue excision, fulfilling severe cannibalistic fantasies. These post-mortem rituals provided the intense psychological gratification required to relieve his immense internal pressure. Bizarre, frenzied movements around the crime scene often concluded his ritual. The subject would perform manic, circling patterns, reveling in the absolute power he had finally achieved. Each attack briefly alleviated his escalating madness. Yet, this dark catharsis was always temporary, guaranteeing that the cycle of hunting and destruction would inevitably repeat itself. He navigated this dual existence flawlessly. The mundane bureaucratic worker transformed seamlessly into an apex predator driven by an insatiable, overwhelming psychological void. The predator was operating with terrifying efficiency, but every perfectly constructed system eventually encounters a fatal flaw. And soon, the entire protective structure would begin to break down. The investigation eventually underwent a profound methodological shift. Decades of strict institutional denial finally crumbled as authorities acknowledged a single predator was actively operating across the transit network. To capture an invisible threat, detectives enlisted modern psychological analysis. A groundbreaking behavioral profile was created, perfectly predicting the subject's age, mundane occupation, and deep-seated social inadequacies. This highly accurate psychological blueprint completely shattered his carefully constructed mask. Authorities stopped looking for an obvious villain and started hunting a quiet, unremarkable, and seemingly submissive citizen. He was a man who blended seamlessly into the rigid bureaucracy. The profile understood that investigators were severely hampered by a fractured system that refused to share information. Yet, a rare biological anomaly had previously shielded him from justice. The subject was a non-secretor, meaning his routine blood type did not match other collected forensic samples. This severe scientific blind spot had allowed him to slip through a prior arrest. The mismatched evidence convinced earlier detectives to release him, leaving his deadly impunity intact. The magnitude of this error haunted the task force. They realized the predator had manipulated their own forensic limitations, confidently returning to his desolate woodland hunting grounds unchecked. Desperate to break the cycle, investigators adapted their strategy. They launched a massive, coordinated surveillance operation, casting a wide net across regional railway stations and isolated transport hubs. The trap was meticulously set. Plainclothes officers silently watched the platforms, patiently waiting for the profile to step out of the shadows and approach a vulnerable, isolated target. The immense pressure of his internal compulsion clouded his judgment. The predator finally made a critical, irreversible mistake that would permanently shatter his long-held illusion of absolute safety. Emerging from the dark forest margins, his formal attire betrayed him. An undercover officer noticed his grass-stained knees and a highly suspicious dark smudge across his sweating cheek. Furthermore, a fresh, self-treated wound marked his hand. A desperate victim had violently bitten his finger during a frantic struggle, leaving an undeniable physical scar of his crimes. He was briefly stopped and questioned by the patrol. Although temporarily released, his identity was officially flagged, connecting him directly to the extensive, previously discarded suspect archive files. Detectives cross-referenced his mundane bureaucratic travel logs. The dates perfectly aligned with a multitude of disappearances, finally illuminating the dark path he had walked through the decaying empire. Law enforcement placed the subject under intense, continuous surveillance. They quietly observed his disturbing, predatory behavior as he systematically approached isolated individuals at various urban bus stops. His every move was now tracked and heavily scrutinized. The authorities watched as the once invisible ghost frantically tried to initiate contact, completely unaware that the hunt was over. The illusion of the harmless, pathetic academic was entirely destroyed. Plainclothes operatives swiftly surrounded him outside a local establishment, moving with absolute, calculated precision to end his reign. He was placed in heavy handcuffs without a single moment of resistance. The predator who had terrorized the isolated woodlands was peacefully absorbed into the cold judicial machinery. Locked inside a stark interrogation cell, the mundane facade finally collapsed. The subject was trapped, entirely stripped of his anonymity and forced to confront the investigative task force. Capturing the profile was merely the first obstacle. Breaking his silence would require navigating a complex psychological labyrinth. And the arrest is only the beginning of what comes next. The legal proceedings were unprecedented. To protect him from the sheer rage of the grieving families, the subject was placed inside a heavy iron cage in the courtroom. Throughout the trial, his behavior was highly erratic and deeply disruptive. He frequently shouted political slogans, sang anthems, and exposed himself to the shocked spectators. Psychiatric experts observed that this manic courtroom performance sharply contrasted with his calm demeanor in his cell. It was a calculated, desperate attempt to feign profound insanity. The families of the victims filled the room, weeping and demanding absolute retribution. The immense collective trauma was palpable, representing a society deeply scarred by his actions. At one point, a grieving relative hurled a heavy piece of metal at the cage, striking him. Security struggled as the crowd physically shielded the young man. Despite his chaotic disruptions, the court determined he completely understood the criminality of his actions. He was ultimately found guilty of 52 catastrophic counts of homicide. The judge sentenced the profile to death. Upon hearing the final verdict, he violently kicked his bench and shouted abuse, finally dropping the pathetic, harmless facade. Appeals for clemency were swiftly rejected by the highest authorities. He was transferred to a soundproofed prison chamber, where the sentence was carried out with absolute finality. He was buried in a completely unmarked grave within the bleak confines of the prison cemetery. The man who sought absolute control was erased into ultimate obscurity. His capture forced a monumental shift in regional law enforcement. It completely shattered the ideological myth that such predators only existed in decadent capitalist nations. Due to emerging media transparency, the horrifying magnitude of the crimes became entirely public. The state could no longer hide systemic failures behind a wall of censorship. The investigation revolutionized local criminological practices. It marked the very first time psychological and behavioral profiling was officially utilized to hunt an unknown predator in the region. Forensic protocols were completely overhauled. The catastrophic error surrounding his biological fluid anomalies served as a stark warning, pushing authorities to adopt more precise scientific testing methods. Detectives who spent a decade chasing shadows were finally vindicated. The profound necessity for cross-jurisdictional communication and shared databases became an undeniable priority for future investigations. For the victims' families, the aftermath offered a grim closure. Yet, the deep psychological wounds inflicted upon the community would take entire generations to fully heal. The profound loss of over 50 individuals left a permanent, chilling void. The dark woods and desolate transit stations stood as silent monuments to the vanished. The case provided an unprecedented, terrifying look into the mechanics of extreme psychopathy. It proved that profound evil could successfully camouflage itself behind an impeccably boring exterior. He operated as a phantom within a rigid bureaucracy, weaponizing his own mediocrity. The profile exploited systemic blind spots, feeding his dark compulsions entirely unchecked for years. We have retraced his fractured origins, examined his calculated methods, and witnessed the inevitable collapse of his mundane mask under the crushing weight of modern behavioral science. The exhaustive analysis of his psychology and horrific crimes is now complete. We now have all the necessary elements to finally classify this predator's definitive psychological archetype.
The mystery is over. The trump card is on the table. So, did you recognize him?
The entity we have tracked through the decaying Soviet infrastructure is Andrei Chikatilo, universally recognized in criminal history as the Rostov Ripper. Within this psychological analysis, we classify his profile as the Red Forest Beast. This specific alias was chosen to reflect his systematic reliance on the isolated woodland strips bordering the vast railway networks, the literal dark forests where he isolated society's most vulnerable targets. To fully deconstruct the mechanics of his pathology, we evaluate him through the Pentagon of Evil framework. Operating unchecked between 1978 and 1990, Chikatilo is confirmed to have claimed over 52 victims. His archetype is defined by a terrifyingly banal camouflage. A seemingly submissive, unassuming school teacher peering passively through thick glasses. He weaponized this unremarkable exterior to gain absolute trust, hiding his devastating internal compulsions behind a flawless mask of societal conformity. Premeditation, 7 out of 10. While highly opportunistic, Chikatilo demonstrated calculated foresight. He purposefully navigated specific bus depots and railway hubs, carrying the necessary tools to secure his targets. He utilized well-rehearsed psychological ruses, offering food, alcohol, or rare items to build immediate trust with marginalized individuals. His premeditation was spatial rather than strictly victim-specific. He did not stalk individuals for weeks, but rather engineered the perfect predatory environment, ensuring he only struck when absolute geographic isolation was guaranteed. Signature, 8 out of 10. His signature was driven by profound biological inadequacy and severe psychological dysfunction. Chikatilo's actions at the crime scene went far beyond the utilitarian need to kill. He required the victim's suffering to achieve arousal, substituting conventional intimacy with escalating physical destruction. The ritualistic infliction of numerous, specific knife wounds, the blinding of targets to remove their judging gaze, and the post-mortem excision of tissues formed a rigid, highly disturbed psychological sequence that he was absolutely compelled to complete. Mobility, 8 out of 10. Chikatilo leveraged his employment as a regional supply clerk to achieve exceptional geographic reach. His bureaucratic duties required constant movement across the vast, interconnected transit networks of the Soviet Union. This allowed him to strike in multiple distinct regions, including Russia, Ukraine, and Uzbekistan, effectively dispersing his crime scenes. By utilizing trains and buses for official business trips, he maintained a perfectly legitimate reason for his constant travel, seamlessly distancing himself from the locations where his victims vanished. Resistance, 7 out of 10. His ability to evade capture for 12 years was heavily bolstered by systemic failures and a rare biological anomaly. Chikatilo successfully maintained the outward facade of an ordinary family man and state worker, rendering him invisible to traditional profiling. Crucially, as a non-secretor, his blood type did not match the forensic evidence recovered from early crime scenes. This scientific blind spot allowed him to be dismissed as a suspect following his initial 1984 arrest, cementing his long-term impunity. Impact, 10 out of 10. The sheer magnitude of Chikatilo's crimes fundamentally altered the societal and institutional fabric of his nation. Claiming over 52 lives, he shattered the long-held ideological myth that such serial predators could not exist within a socialist state. His unprecedented case forced authorities to abandon strict censorship, overhaul forensic protocols, and embrace modern behavioral profiling for the very first time. The collective trauma inflicted upon the region left a permanent, chilling scar on the national consciousness. Final score, 40 out of 50. Andrei Chikatilo achieved this terrifying threshold through a convergence of lethal mobility, pathological signatures, and systemic forensic blind spots. What does it take for an ordinary person to become a predator? It requires a profound fracture in identity, where immense childhood trauma and biological inadequacy twist into a compulsive need for absolute dominance. How does society fail to see it? By clinging to rigid ideologies and refusing to believe that such darkness can reside behind a banal, unremarkable exterior. Chikatilo weaponized his own mediocrity, proving that the most devastating monsters are often those hiding in plain sight.
Some monsters are born in the shadows. Others are the shadow itself. The verdict is etched in stone, but make no mistake, evil never stops. It simply changes its face. Many more monsters await dissection on this channel. Stay vigilant. Case closed.